I don't really know where to stand because we're in the round, but I'll just start introducing tonight's event. My name is Harry Burke. I'm assistant curator at Artist Space, and it's a pleasure to welcome you here tonight for tonight's open discussion in the last instance. Oh, yeah. Tonight's event developed out of a conversation with Aliza Shvarts and Joshua Lubin-Levy, who are the co-editors of Living Labor, Marxism and Performance Studies, a special issue of Women Performance, a journal of feminist theory, which is an influential journal founded in 1983 by graduate students in the Department of Performance Studies at New York University's Tisch School of the Arts. I'm going to allow Josh and Aliza to introduce the themes of this issue, as well as to frame the specific concerns of tonight's discussion. However, I'd like to note that there are copies of Living Labor that are available to browse upstairs, should you like to take a look at it after the conversation, and that there are photocopies of some of the essays from the journal that are available at the bar, which you can take home, copy and distribute as you'd like. We decided to set up the room in this way in the round to create a format in which all audience members feel encouraged to participate in the discussion. So please feel free to feel encouraged to interject and contribute. We have 2 wireless microphones that will be in circulation. I guess I'll try and be in charge of one, and the other one will just be autonomous, and we'll see how that works. Following the initial framing by the Living Labor editors, the conversation will be informed by pre-prepared prompts from Avram Finkelstein and Kameelah, Janan, Rasheed. I will leave it to Josh and Aliza to make further introductions, but I would like to say, however, how delighted Artist Space are to be hosting you both. I'd like to extend a warm thank you to the Friends of Artist Space and the Artist Space Program Fund Artist for supporting our programming. And finally, I'd like also to make a note of the current exhibition at Artist Space, which is Laura Cottingham and the Anita Pallenberg story. This, in many ways, is a document of the culture wars of the 1990s, and it has as its centerpiece a filmic satire of the commercial art market at the turn of the millennium, explored through the lens of life backstage of the Rolling Stones, circa 1968. Entrance is free. It's open Wednesday to Sunday, noon to 6 p.m. through June 18th, so please do feel welcome to come back and view it, and we'll also leave it running for a while after the talk, should you need to decompress whilst watching the film. So without any further ado, over to Aliza and Josh.
Thank you so much, Harry. Applause for Harry. Thank you. So as Harry mentioned, we'd like to keep this a lateral discussion. So I will say a little bit, just introducing the themes of the issue. Our 2 prompters will present prompts, but we really do encourage a discussion. So we'll be passing mics around, and please feel free to contribute in any way that you feel is the way you want to contribute. I thought, though, that I would set up a little bit of this special issue, which is called Living Labor. This event came out of that special issue. That special issue came out of a conference that Josh and I organized. And like all good Marxist conferences, this conference came out of revenge. Josh and I were at another Marxist conference a year before we organized Living Labor, and we're disturbed at how things like queer Marxism, feminist Marxism, and Black Marxism were not just marginalized in the conversation, but actually excluded altogether. So we wanted to organize an event that would foreground these frameworks. Out of that came the special issue. Some of our contributors are actually here tonight to the special issue. I just want to acknowledge So-Young Yoon and Alan Ruiz. So thank you so much for being here tonight. And if you'd like to take a look at what they've written, there are photocopies on the bar. But I thought I would begin by reading a little bit from the introduction that Josh and I co-wrote that sets up some of the themes. It begins with an epigraph by Karl Marx. Capital is dead labor, which, vampire-like, lives only by sucking living labor, and lives the more labor it sucks. To live and to labor are the twinned imperatives to which we are already given. Together, they animate a rhythm of material production and reproduction that extends over time. This special issue of Women in Performance examines how thinking about life and labor between Marxism and performance studies can help us attend to the world at hand. Living Labor began as a conference hosted by the Department of Performance Studies at New York University, which took place in April 2014. It featured over 70 presentations, film screenings, artist presentations, and keynote addresses by Fred Moten and Sayan Nye. The provocation of this conference was to ask what formal criteria could be articulated between aesthetic analysis and political economy. That is, how does performance analysis bring together the living body and the working body? How do Marxist and Marxist-inspired philosophies articulate and reimagine labor, value, and revolutionary struggle, particularly in relation to the social, aesthetic, and political dimensions of performance and performativity? How are theories of difference, which cut across divisions of race, gender, sexuality, and disability, differently animated by the many histories of anti-capitalist critique? These are the questions that many of our contributors took up in their essays for the special issue, but they're also questions that we think are enduring and warrant further and continued conversation. That's the idea behind the roundtable tonight. We've invited Avram Finkelstein and Kameelah, Janan, Rasheed to give us some prompts to sort of help further this conversation, and we invite all of you to participate in sort of grappling with these questions here and now. So without further ado, Avram, I will hand it over to you.
So I'm counting on a lively conversation, and anyone who doesn't talk, I'm going to make sit in the front row. I'm going to do it family style. Can you? Yes. Okay. So I wanted to talk a little bit about abstraction and resistance. And I want to start by talking about this moment. You can read along with me for those who can see my laptop. So it's commonly understood that the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand in 1914 set the political events of the entire 20th century in motion. And since the turn of the 21st, I've had my ear to the ground looking for this single incident that might trigger the consequences for the 21st. And the 2016 American election was undoubtedly that moment. Our having joined the global march of proto-fascism will no doubt lead to many novel and previously unimagined expressions of it, but for those of us who sit outside of power structures, nothing new is actually articulated here, except perhaps that the oligarchies of oil have been displaced for the moment by oligarchies of speculation and hackable information, the spoils of the combined Russian-American surveillance economies that have been going on for a really long time and that Trump rode into office on. Because the horizon of this new oligarchy is still a frontier, it's hard to say whether Trump might actually be the final nail in the coffin of humanity, as some people I know are fearing, or if the cyber vapor expelled by the perpetual motion machine of internet content resulting from our first reality television presidency represents the dying gasp of whiteness. One thing is certain, Trump doesn't care about what's on the horizon at all. We do, which I believe means that the future belongs to the resistance. And I think we're in a funny moment. Media outlets are somewhat obsessed with the idea of whether a resistance can actually succeed. But while analyzing the efficacy of political resistance might be useful for journalists, referring to it as a success or a failure is to frame it in the language of capital. Resistance as an accomplishment. And I think that that's a big mistake, especially when capitalism is in the chokehold of totalitarianism. But moreover, resistance is not an accomplishment or a thing or an object or even an objective. It's a gesture, it's a project. And it can't be acquired at all. It can only be activated, and it needs no endpoint to express its efficacy, in my opinion. So if the language of capital is at all appropriate here, it might be found within the contestation of the body as capital, which is born of feminist critiques and trans explorations of technology as prosthesis, and recently the spike in conversations about queer abstraction, which is what I'd like to delve into a little bit tonight. To be queer is to be an archaeologist. In order to find traces of ourselves in a world that prefers we be hidden, we excavate, sifting through our cultural landscape for ancestral signs, oftentimes as a matter of survival. And so detritus, the archival, the supernatural are all queer turf to be explored, as is erasure, inscription, negative space, mess making and charting the periphery, thrift, cryptography, and affect, and also performance, metamorphosis, temporality, refusal, and the defining disposition of the late 20th century postmodernism. But now that we're well into the second decade of the 21st, I can't help but notice the feature on the landscape that hints most boldly at the actual expansion of queer turf might be queer abstraction, which I'm capaciously defining as the alternatively sighted body. To the extent that abstraction might be seen as a rejection of corporeal meaning making, queer abstraction reflects an explosive corporeality, and in a way it implies a reinvention of meaning that postmodernism dismantled. I feel like we're in this interesting sort of turning point where artists are trying to figure out how to be in the 21st century. So I think there's something happening here. It could potentially be the reinvention of meaning, or a recoded corporeality, at least, that's a hybrid of the vestigial remains of the 20th century found in abstraction and postmodernism, a squaring of those two things. So I would say a queering of abstraction carries particular weight during Trump's branded return to American greatness, a moment when the queer political dilemma is not at all academic. And this abstraction traces the outlines of the state of the queer union far more accurately than any queer assimilation that preceded it. I don't think that told us anything about the state of the queer union. It's said that the non-ideological nature of abstractionism enabled it to fly under the radar during the last resurgence of American greatness, which was the McCarthy years, by masking the politics of the artists who made it. So in a way, abstraction might not only provide safe haven for the queer body, but I think it's also worth exploring as a strategy for political and cultural resistance. And finally, I would say that all queer art is political art because, like it or not, to be queer is to be political. So a queering of practices is what I believe is called for now. Queer expressionism, queer mess-making, queer dumpster diving, queer decentering, and the affective kindnesses of queer abstraction. Consolidation of institutional power is by nature antithetical to the kind of experimentation that I'm advocating and noticing. So they won't be watching us here as we root around in the dirt. We've been asking about the queer body for a while now, but as we explore queer abstractionism, as this leads us to explore queer abstractionism, shouldn't we also ask what a queering of political agency might look like, or a queered resistance? What does a queered image literacy look like? And what does queered propaganda look like here in the 21st century digital oligarchy? Thanks.
So we'd like to invite discussion now, and a bit later we will have the second prompt, which might redirect or maybe just further the train of conversation.
I really liked your point about the language of success or failure being a capitalist notion, and I think that's really important to keep in mind during the perpetual threat of cynicism and defeatism that the left always faces, and especially now. I guess, could you go beyond that? Could you elaborate on that concept and just ways that maybe your strategies that you're using to keep yourself rejuvenated or refreshed or not totally defeated?
Not surprisingly, I have a lot of things to say about that. I think that one direct way that I've been thinking about is the construction surrounding the ways in which success is being gauged with the resistance to Trump. And I think it's really a million-person march is super intoxicating, and I'm not in any way speaking against it. I think there should be a million-person marches, and every single one of us should go to every single one of them. But I think that one way to rethink the meaning of this moment might be imagining what groups of, taking that million people and breaking it into groups of 4 and 5 for an ongoing campaign of resistance in affinity group style. When you think that the Pussy Riot was 4 people with a boombox, and Vaina was five people in 23 seconds graffitied the bridge in front of the KGB headquarters. I think that the ways in which the problem with the large spectacle is we then are treated to the inevitable deconstruction of the meaning of what just happened. And the 24/7 talking heads is, saying, well, the largest march in history was this, and this is bigger than that, but what happens now? So in a way, we're sort of setting it up to be dissected. We're setting, as empowering as that moment can be, there is this wave effect of late-stage American capitalism that will pull it apart. So I think we have to think of things that can't be anticipated that could really fuck with them, that they haven't thought of yet. And by the time they're responding to it, 10 more people are doing 10 other things somewhere else. That's one way that I'm thinking about this moment. You're going to be like Oprah, right?
I won't. I'm not going to touch the mic after this, I hope. But I just wanted to add, now as not a facilitator, but just another person in the conversation, I'm interested to know what strategies people in this room use to accomplish precisely this type of resistance. A lot of us are practitioners, a lot of us are engaged in aesthetic as well as political endeavors, and I wonder if anyone would be interested in sharing what discoveries they might have made about their own forms of resistance that don't necessarily take up a progress narrative complicit with capitalism.
I have maybe a response to that, but it dovetails into a question that I have for you, Avram, is I've arrived at something in my moving image practice. I've come to call it like the aesthetics of the provisional, and the provisional is something that cannot be commodified because it's moving, right? So it can't be branded as easily. And then, Avram, you mentioned something about no end point for the resistance, and that you didn't say you welcomed that, but that should be thought through. And I really want to know, what does that look like? Do you have any ideas on what that actually looks like aesthetically? And then also, how does that operate in terms of what you just said, which I think is very interesting, that we come at them with something else and constantly. How does that work with our moment of acceleration right now that is also a problematic and one thing that moves with the forces of capitalism?
Yeah, I think those are super interesting questions. I think we should all need to be mic'd. Uh, and I think that's a super interesting set of observations and questions, and what I would have to say about it might really plug into your practice. When I think about the question of endpoints, I feel like resistance, again, it's a performance, it's a gesture, and the thing about it that they don't tell us, the thing that they're telling us is bad about it, is that it comes and it goes. There's a pendulum swing to social engagement, and resistance is just a part of history. And but I actually think of it as an organism. I think it's a thing that we pick up, and it's activated when we pick it up, and it dies the second we put it down, but it is reborn when someone else picks it up. And I think that that's that speaks very much to your practice and the question of provisional or performative interlocking collectivity. I realize I'm like being super wonky about this, and it's not really my nature. I'm a propagandist, and I tend to be very didactic and err on the side of flat-footedness, but I think that one thing that I've noticed about this moment is really smart people that I really respect are walking into walls with their hair on fire, trying to figure out how to fix it. But I think there's something so sort of male about the idea that something discrete happened, as opposed to decades of the dismantling of voting rights acts and gerrymandering that brought us 3 houses of Republicans in every branch of government, or that Roe v. Wade hasn't been being dismantled for generations. The things that are... Trump did not invent any of those things. These things... This is America. This is what America has been for centuries. So I feel like they pull the strings we're supposed to dance. We don't actually have to dance. We can collaboratively, if we remove the idea of having a concrete thing to show, of being able to fix Trump, and it's like, I think that's really the wrong way to look at it. The fact is that Mike Pence scares me way more than Trump is, if you know anything about his record and where things are heading. And it's even conceivable that it was always intended that I don't think Trump expected to win. I don't think he wanted to win. I think he just is in the fucking White House. But I think of social engagement and resistance as a lifelong activity. And I don't feel compelled, I don't feel bad if I can't go to a march. I know that I will be doing 10 other things, and I'm really happy that this half of the room will go to that march. And I think that's how we have to think about this moment, but I think it's also how we have to think about capitalism in general, and the idea of dismantling it is not exactly the question. The question is, how do you fuck with it? And that changes all the time. And I think we're in this moment of transition, where the questions of how we got here have way more to do with Kim Kardashian than they do with Mike Pence, in a way. That's how I'm thinking about this moment.
In terms of resistance, I think in terms of like the performative qualities of it, it's privilege insofar as like all throughout this entire time, like you've been speaking, I've been thinking about race and how a resistance is something that's practiced and something that's like consistently embodied. So like as a person of color who does engage with the world with a double consciousness, I'm constantly resisting in terms of how I'm holding my tongue and in just the weight that I bear as a person of color who oftentimes serves as a representative of the community. And so with resistance, I think that it has less to do with, I think while there needs to be like this like dichotomy of like, self-care and, preservation in terms of interest and taking care of oneself, but also being able to like physically and even like linguistically like get in the way of someone else. And I think that exchange is really important in terms of in terms of like provoking a reaction as a white person, as a privileged person, because the resistance is something you can take off and sit down and not pick up for a while, and that's a privilege that not many people are afforded. And so I think, and it's the language with these movements that's so I guess like problematic, and it's like lazy. It's like, oh, I can tweet or I can talk to my friend about it and feel justified in my own right, but that's like how we got here, and so I think like looking back on what has happened in terms of like civil rights movements and the whole Black Lives Matter, they were very like it's really complicated, obviously, but I think that we're at this place where we, like what you said about this like queering of like these spaces is so important, because we're at a point where we need new language, because the language has completely failed us. And so a resistance and like it's like this like kitsch culture born all over again, with like resistance and like autonomy and empowerment, and like it's just bullshit. It's like these words that are thrown around that aren't productive. And so in when we use these words, I feel like they do reduce the efforts of those people of color who have constantly been organizing, or like white like people who are constantly organizing, and being able to acknowledge the efforts of those who participated in the civil rights movements, who were actively like who were both white and of color, who came together, who fought relentlessly to combat like that racism. But it was like that physical physical gesture that I think is really important, because it's easy to like call someone out over the internet, but I think that we need to do more and start specifically with like organizing and just being hyper aware of like how we're perpetuating these stereotypes by like, just because you come to a talk like this doesn't necessarily mean you're absolved from how you exercise your privilege in your day-to-day exchanges. And so I think that it's really easy to like gaslight a resistance verbally, or by like donating $5 to the Women's March or going to DC, but it's not that easy for a person of color who's consistently and continually marginalized on a day-to-day basis, because a resistance is waking up in the morning and putting on your shoes and walking out of the door. And so I think that just realizing who bears the weight and who's affected the most is most important, because otherwise, like I was thinking like, okay, well, this queering is so important, but like, is this organization taking place from the top down or bottom up? Because if you're not thinking about those people who don't even have the resources to organize and advocate for themselves or voice like how they're affected personally, then like it's pointless, because it's like we're existing in this vacuum. Yeah.
I loved your idea about language, because I think that is the key thing. And I think that, here we are in an art space, and I don't come out of a master's program. I'm like, my family wasn't able to afford that. And so a lot of the language that we inherited for how we talk about this, as well as the sensitivities that people have about the questions of political engagement, are completely steeped in colonization. That's what Western European aesthetics enforces. We're all a part of that. And I think I love the idea of the simple gesture of language being a way of activating social spaces in and of itself. I think it's super smart, what you just said.
Maybe, ooh, wow. Maybe if I could just add a little bit to that, which is to say that I think also part of what I really loved about your prompt, Avram, was the idea that some of the questions that have always percolated around any type of political resistance is that navigation with the degree to which a movement becomes an abstraction that actually can unify a community together, and how that becomes a way of leveling down the difference that exists within that community. So within that tension, this idea of actually, instead of thinking about the end result, like the goal that will kind of ameliorate everyone, it becomes about attending to the process of bringing people together. And that can happen on this grand scale, but it can also happen on very minute scales. It can happen in a daily embodied practice, and then we all come to that level in very different degrees, with very different kind of backgrounds and histories and degrees of privilege. But along those lines, that's for me what's so important about the introduction of some question of performance to this whole thing, because performance is an attention to questions of the aesthetic, as well as to the surplus populations that some would prefer don't exist at all. And I think in some ways that's also, this is not a pat on the back, but it's also to say, like, it's part of sitting in a room together in uncomfortable silence too, where like maybe the most we do today is spend time here, and what does that allow for? What kind of thinking is happening? But to not mandate that this conversation have a productive result or a certain direction, or that we stay on any one topic. And also that we have to navigate then what expectations are. I mean, we've invited you all to come here. If you have certain questions for us, we're happy to answer them. But that really it is about an opening up of that space to think about how do we actually crack these systems open in some ways. Even the ones that we're immersed in when we all come together ostensibly under the same guise of, sharing a certain kind of outlook, being at artist space, being interested in the themes today, or the artists who've generously contributed their time to give prompts here. So there's really no direction that this all has to go. And it really remains open in that way. And I just hope that is something we can mark in the space.
Hi. I was thinking about the comment that you made about abstraction earlier. And I've been thinking a lot about language over the past few months, especially with the news and reading the statements that politicians and those who write the news make in terms of explanations and lies and honesty. And I find it really confusing and really heartbreaking. And I find myself really easily manipulated. For example, yesterday when Trump shared some state secrets with some Russian officials, one of the things that I saw while scrolling the web was this article that said why we should welcome the Russians. And I was confused as to where that came from, and I felt like it was this bot that put it into my feed, and it was really strange. And anyways, I've been thinking a lot about the way that people speak and how to speak when the current administration has mastered the language of reality TV and also like stand-up comedy. I think that SNL is really doing some good work, but at the same time, they can't really top what Trump is doing and what the current administration is coming out with. And so I think a lot about how we can speak and what like humor means now. And I don't have an answer for that, but I think about it a lot.
Just to follow up on that, I've been thinking a lot about narrative forms, especially how we sort of encounter the news, but also how we tell ourselves who it is we are, and how long those narratives take. So especially like teaching history, like thinking about how long it takes to learn a certain kind of narrative and how long it takes to dismantle a kind of narrative. Just to follow on, that's been something I've been thinking a lot about too.
I think to add to the conversation, maybe it's time to introduce the second prompt. For everyone who's standing up, there's more chairs back here, so if you would like to come have a seat, please do. But I will turn it over to Kameelah to deliver our second prompt.
Thank you. That was an almost perfect segue, because I'm really interested in thinking about language and how we construct narratives of history. And so I spent the last decade of my life, I guess still, teaching history to high school students. And what's always interesting about that is that in order to sort of get through about 10,000 years of history, you have to do some very interesting and creative work around creating these very sort of neat narrative packages to help students literally trot through 10,000 years of history. And so the prompt that I'm sort of thinking about today is organized around this thing that I kept hearing be said after the election, which just annoyed the shit out of me. And I couldn't figure out what was annoying about it until I took the time to sort of unpack it and do some more reading. And it was the phrase I kept hearing, which was now more than ever. And I'm sure people have read all the think pieces about this, and hopefully this is not an annoying redundancy. But I just wanted to spend a little bit more time on this because I think beyond it being historically irresponsible and non-rigorous and problematic, I think it also speaks to a sort of a generalized discomfort with discomfort. And so what does it mean to approach or engage in a political moment that may feel unfamiliar to you, but very familiar to lots of other people? But what does it also mean for us to find new ways of reading moments? And what does it also mean for us to think about legibility? And so I'm gonna talk through 6 ideas, which as I list them, they're not gonna sound connected, but in the next 4 minutes, I will connect them. So the first idea is around speech pathology and stutters. The other idea is around ecosystems and relational design of oppressive structures. The third one is like a anecdotal story about hair braiding as a kid and sort of ideas of parallel undoing and doing. Ideas around entropy and invasive species as we think about messy histories and the ways that we make sense of histories that sort of sprawl. And then the last idea is around issues of rhythm and comfort. And how we think about rhythm as we sort of think through narrative structures. And so I'll start back in high school in 2002. And I went to a very elite private Catholic school in Northern California, and I remember in our history class, everyone had learned about the civil rights movement, and I remember students trying to explain to me the horrors that had happened, and they were just like very, very excited that they had learned this new thing. And also very, very excited to sort of teach me this new thing, and me sort of being in this moment of extreme annoyance, because I'm like, I already knew that, A, but B, this is a situation that people have sort of gone through for quite some time, and then sort of flashing forward to this moment now, where people are having this sudden epiphany around things that are horrible and tragic about oppression, but these are things that people have lived with for a very long time. And so me sort of thinking through what does it mean to live in a country and for people to literally live in different temporal planes. So what does it mean to literally not even know, or for oppression to be a legible part of your daily reading of the world, and then for it to suddenly be an awareness, and then for that to be so uncomfortable that there is a sudden desire to sort of preach and tell everyone about a thing that they've already viscerally experienced. And so I'm thinking about all these things that I listed, which I'm going to connect now, with regards to speech pathology and how we narrate time. There's this poet, Susan Howe, who talks a lot about this idea of the stutter and what the stutter means. And she has this quote where she says, the stutter is the plot. So this idea that our sort of being beholden to linearity, being beholden to this idea that history sort of progresses in this very neat not messy sort of path sort of beholds us to a moment where we can't actually look at nuance. We're so fixated on getting to the end of a thing that we think is going to happen or the thing that feels comfortable that we don't sort of sit in the discomfort or the messiness. And so that is really interesting to me because if you look at speech pathology around stuttering, that's literally the moment where you're trying to get a bunch of words out, but they sort of stumble over themselves and things can't get out. And usually we sort of rush over those moments to preserve the ego of the person who is speaking, who is stuttering, but it's actually in that moment that we sort of need to slow down to figure out what is happening at that exact moment where that person is trying to get out all of these words. And if we think about it in the historical context, what is happening at this exact moment where we're trying to rush forward to this one particular thing and it doesn't actually happen. And then thinking through hair braiding, when I was a kid, my mom used to braid my hair. And I used to do this annoying thing where as she was braiding my hair and getting to the end, I would be taking out the top. So just think about that for a second. She's braiding the end of my hair, and she thinks that she's done. She's so fixated on getting done on a Sunday night. I've already undone the top. This is always interesting to me because I hadn't thought about this until I had a conversation on some of my group chat about this, which is the way that we think about resistance now is there's a fixation for people who are resisting particular structures. To focus so much on the getting done of what you are intending to get done that we lose focus of what is happening at the point of undoing, right? And so we're moving forward towards this thing, but people are also making progress in other ways that sort of threaten the thing that we're doing. And so me being interested in this parallel process of time sort of moving forward for you where you're braiding to the end and you think that you've gotten to this particular point, but there's this subtle undoing that's happening that you don't notice until sometimes it feels too late. And me sort of thinking through the ways that we've been narrating this political moment as a prime example of this process of undoing that sort of went unnoticed by the people who are speaking most about it, but felt very noticeable for the people who were experiencing it. I guess the last two things I'll say, and then I'll stop speaking, are just around entropy and invasive species. When this whole art thing ends, and I leave it, my goal is to become a biologist, and sort of the process towards moving toward that is sort of thinking through what fascinates me about biology and ecosystems, and a lot of it has to do with thinking through these ideas around invasive species, and this idea that an ecosystem can be invaded at any point, and that the ecosystem needs to be able to absorb and to be able to bounce back and to be able to accommodate this new thing that's invaded it. And me thinking about this a lot in the way that we understand history as constantly being interrupted by these moments that don't seem like they fit, but we need to make sense of them and accommodate them into the way that we narrate our present moment, but also thinking through the way that we narrate this present moment dictates how we can actually move towards the future. And so, I think to sort of tie or braid it all together, I think my fascination here is thinking about how we narrate this moment, not because this moment is so dramatically different from other moments, but because so much is dependent upon how we narrate this moment, because it will dictate how we move forward toward a future. And there are two books, just in case you want a reading list, there are two books that I think are really useful in thinking through this. The first one is David C. Scott's Conscripts of Modernity, where he is basically talking about lots of things, but one of the things he is talking about is the Haitian Revolution, and this book, The Black Jacobins, where this whole narrative of the Haitian Revolution is written as a sort of triumphant, romantic narrative of these slaves who have this uprising, they take over, they start this beautiful Black Republic, and sort of the story ends there. And then his rewriting of that narrative many years later, where he sort of reroutes the story as a story of tragedy. And thinking through tragedy as a productive narrative arc for us to think about this time, because it sort of puts us in a position where we have to deal with the unresolved messy bits, and it also puts us in a position where all the things that we've accumulated don't sort of give us a promised future. And so what does it mean to sort of look at the accumulation of the things that we've done in the past, the revolutions we've had in the past, the movements we've had in the past, and to also recognize that all those things accumulated don't promise us a particular future.
I just want to quickly respond to First of all, really love everything that you've said. I've also been recently thinking about invasive species a lot because I've been called one in my relationship with other people. But then thinking about how that label works in my own personal life narratives, and thinking about, you know, like having experienced transnational mobility, you know, like being at different places where I feel like I don't belong, and having to prove my legitimacy. But then also thinking about, you know, sometimes the invasive species wants to do good. Like it's this like moment of rupture that is like so threatening. But there is space for everyone, and how we, you know, like redefine space. And basically I'm trying to think about ways to reclaim being called out as an invasive species, but then, you know, like feel like that's not like a shameful label to embody, but more like, yeah, like I invade, but I also exist, and there's like validity to it too.
I can do it. You don't have to do it unless you want to. Avram, do it again. Oh, to fill this, to take. No, if you have, that's great. I figured you would. I just thought I'd give you a break.
Thank you. I feel in a familial way, very comfortable. I loved what you had to say about I wanted to hear a little bit more about rhythm and comfort, and I also wanted to hear, I thought you said you had 2 books to recommend?
I did. I misspoke. I only had one.
Oh, you only had one?
I only had one. I can give you a list of articles, though, but I only had one. But I can speak a little bit more about rhythm. So I spent a lot of time listening to music, and I was listening to music while doing research on entropy, which ended up being a fascinating sort of interdisciplinary research project, in that a lot of the research that I found talked about the most enjoyable types of music is the music that has the highest sort of entropy, this idea that not being able to predict the next thing that's going to happen, being a deeply enjoyable musical experience because your body sort of like gives into it because it doesn't have a predictable next step, right? And so me being fascinated by what it means to sort of not be beholden to a particular plot, not to be beholden to a particular predictability. And so I think when it comes to understanding history and narrating time, I'm fascinated by rhythm, because I think that we are beholden to a certain rhythm with the way that we tell stories about time, and a certain rhythm about how we listen to stories about time. And while having that particular rhythm that's familiar and predictable feels good, it's also deceptive in a lot of ways, because in the process of being beholden to that rhythm and going along with the beat of what's happening, there's a lot of nuance that's lost. There's a lot of things that need to be broken down that don't get broken down because we're so beholden to this and so in tune with what we think is going to come next or what should come next, that when something that doesn't come next comes next, we grow uncomfortable and we sort of just move and jump forward. And I'm really interested in those moments of us slowing down to really think about. I do believe that at this moment it is important for people to march for both the optics of it, but also for like the generative possibilities of it. But I also think there's something to be said about taking the time to actually read and talk to other people and to make sense, because I think that thinking is good. And I think that reading is good, and I think that processing is good, and I think that in the efforts to get to this particular answer, to have particular optics around what we're doing, we go for the things that are most optically primal, right? So things, being seen marketing is optically very advantageous. There's not like a very great Instagram photo of someone reading a book or highlighting an article or making sense of that, even though that is an important process, right? And so me, and this white being very interested in what it looks like to slow down, and slowing down not as a rejection of urgency, but slowing down as a recognition of urgency and a recognition that to not slow down might put us in a position where we're undoing things that have already been done, that need to be permanent.
Yeah. I think that you're touching on something that has deep meaning for me. But I think that I tend to think of, to go back to the idea of progress, or like the reason to be engaged or the reason to resist, I tend to think of progress as a spiral rather than a pendulum swing. And I think that pendulum swing is very much the narrative or force-fed. It's like it's the left, then it's the right, and now, you know, you have your turn, and now I'll have my turn, and fuck you while I'm having my turn. But I think it actually, social spaces function very differently. I think it's this sort of ongoing procedure, and it goes to the left and it goes to the right, and it moves forward, and some things are conquered and some things aren't. And I think that is very much the way you're describing the rhythm of the narrative, and sort of surrendering to the comfortable parts of that narrative as opposed to the slower parts or the less easy to explain parts of it. I think there's something, thank you for that.
Thank you for your comment. While you were speaking, it made me think of, I was in a recent protest where one of the organizers said that if you are in a movement and you are not following a woman of color, you are in the wrong movement. And that really struck with me, because not as a question of identity, like who do you follow as your representative, but rather as a question of temporality, like following your comment. Because I think one of the things we have to understand is that that different temporalities and how one lives these temporalities is actually a class issue. Like it is a social category. And the way that one inhabits a time in a space as being a question of politics, not that we all share the same bodies, but we actually live very different temporalities. And perhaps this goes back to the introduction about what it means to assert for Marxism, the feminist, the queer, the black perspective, is not for identity per se, but because those who inhabit these particular temporalities as a social category are attuned to the long histories, as you mentioned, like the slow violences, the cumulative, the repetitive, so much so that it almost seems like the norm. And what does it mean to politicize that? And I just wanted to assert that. And perhaps this goes back to the first comment about not just temporalities, but also the question of language. I think we should, and this is particularly speaking from the position of where I feel the aesthetics has a place, is that capitalism works according to abstraction. So it's not just a question about which language, but the efficacy of language as such is something that we should strive for. I think on two levels. I think one of the shocks of the Trump administration is only to make more explicit how they don't really give a fuck about the symbolic, the ritual, the very symbolic stature of what it means to govern, that it is just naked, brutal interest, self-interest, and that is, it's not that there's something exceptional to the Trump administration, but it is a line that's crossed when laws as a symbolic system do not function. And I think it's something to keep this in mind as we engage in political social engagement. And I think the other thing I just wanted to add is that if capitalism is a form of abstraction, one of the things that I think the aesthetics can do is to try to create and give form to a particularly textured language that gives us a sense of what that abstraction looks like. Like we are speaking, but we might not actually be relating to like that our words slip in relationship to the contingencies of the reality that we are living. So just a couple points.
Yeah, that's such a good point. I've been thinking a lot about like institutional critique, and just in terms of that process, and like specifically like the show at the Brooklyn Museum, and like We Wanted a Revolution, and just how like just as beings with ideologies and experience, we are political, just in how we create and project. But regarding, I guess like the abstraction and language, to get back to institutional critique, just in terms of how representation it fails us. So like as a person of color, as a woman, like we have like all of these terms and this language to represent us and our bodies, but they like can fail us and constantly fail us. So if we have like a feminist show, what about those people who align themselves with the feminist ideologies, but don't see themselves represented in that show? And they then choose to not align themselves with that movement because they've been left out. But specifically with institutional critique and this need to appeal to an institution, to a movement, to a people, I think that I'm really interested in that mess. I think that messiness is really nice, because in messiness you can find your truth, and with the homogeneous reading of history and that linearity of trying to grasp onto this beginning, this middle, and this end, you fail yourself, because there's like a falsehood in trying to to fix oneself and to place oneself in a space that is really fleeting, constantly fleeting actually. But to get back to what you said about, or what you were speaking to about when it comes to education, I think that it's important, and what the word or phrase that came to mind was self-governing. I think that that's something that we should really try to embody in terms of how we negotiate, how we take up space and why we take up space, and the need to be heard and be seen and be felt, and I think that the power of language, like it's important to like again realize the weight of the words and that we like say and that we write, because you say feminists and I hear something completely different, and just like the way that the connotations of these words and like the residue of these words, and how like the lasting effects of like these language, like how languages kind of invade these spaces and really do, I guess, create or build these boundaries, or like this like wall, or this barrier rather, this like barrier between us. I think that like realizing how language can fail us is also just as important. But to get back to education, if we don't know the histories that have like been that have happened, like we won't like, or just like knowing about like how history is homogenous, and like and knowing how to interrupt that, or and it's really important. But we can't do that unless we're held accountable. But I think that rather than like there's like something passive about like being expected to be held accountable, because like you're waiting for someone else to call you out, or you're waiting for someone else. You're like this waiting, and I think that that's why self-governing is so much more important, because you're holding yourself accountable for what you say, for how you say it, and for how you walk through the world.
I wanted to also comment on this idea of the slippage of language, because it actually, I think, really at least brings me back to that idea of the invasive species. And I think this is a really good question, right? Like, is this necessarily, if we're framed in a certain way, right? If we're framed in a way that marginalizes us and renders us a pathology to the national body, is there a way to make that framing work for us? This is something I think a lot about in my work, and I've been thinking a lot recently about virality, right? The viral circulation. And it's interesting, 'cause a lot of narrative circulates virally, and that can have both good and bad effects. But it occurs to me from this conversation that one of the powers of language's failure or slippage, the way in which it's always dealing with abstraction, is precisely that it allows for resignification. It allows for certain claims made about us to be an alibi for action. And I just wanted to offer that as a thought, because at least for me, it sort of maybe gives a more complex way of thinking about these larger ideas that we're talking about, like resistance.
These last couple of comments have really filled me with ideas. But I think it's sort of, one of them is that we've spent a lot of time talking about language, but I think the comments here and here hinted at something about image. And as a propagandist, I'm very painfully aware, I'm almost more aware of image than language. And we live in an image culture, and we're manipulated by images. And I think you sort of hinted, you sort of walked to the edge of that, and I would love to hear if that's what you walked up to it and then walked back from it. So I'd love to hear if I caught the right thing. But I think there's something so interesting about the idea of the abstractions of capital being also founded in image, not just in how we talk about them. Did you?
Oh yeah, I can connect to that a little bit, because I was going to bring up a point about rhythm, and also where like sort of a anti-rhythm is sort of a kind of resistance, and where that then would place pop. Because on one spectrum, you could have like drone music, which sort of physically is a kind of resistance against a pop sound, or like a pop experience of some sort of like beautiful, comforting, like a beautiful music, like experiencing of that. But then you can have like even Lemonade and Beyonce, where it is in some ways, like the pop album is a perfect commodity, but then it is something that's so, that's a object that reached so many people. So in some way, is that like a sort of full circle return to resistance within that? So I just wanted to bring up that, and if that connects back to what you're saying. So.
I guess I'm really interested. That book is not going to stay on my lap. It's going to stay there. I guess I'm really interested in something happened right before this began, when we were all talking about dark matters, and I was talking about a book. Aliza was talking about something else. You were talking about something. We were all talking about three different things, but we'd all engaged in the conversation with the assumption that we were all having a shared definition. And so I think we've all used the words like resistance. We've used a lot of different words that we've not all come to a consensus around their meaning. And I always wonder about definitely how that impacts the way that we move in the world, because if you're entering a conversation and there's an assumption around shared meaning, and you get to the end of a 2-hour meeting, you're like, yeah, so great conversation. Someone else is feeling completely like it wasn't great because the way that they had sort of walked into it doesn't feel fulfilled. But I don't know when that work happens. I feel like because there is such a great urgency around getting a thing done or getting to a particular point, that type of work is often, I think, cast aside as like extraneous or surplus work of like, we don't have time to do this sort of intellectual work because we just need to get to the thing. But the problem that happens is that to get to that type of work, you need to homogenize and sort of hit the most common denominator, which means that any type of subjectivity that lies outside of that common denominator immediately gets sort of pushed to the side, because you're really going for the urgent move of resistance in this particular moment looks like this, or equality in this particular moment looks like this. And so there are lots of things that sort of get lost in that space. And I think the education thing, and I'm going to come back to this, I've been on lots of panels or had lots of conversations where the discourse around education is particularly around post-secondary education. So like what happens when people are in college and what's that experience like? And are they learning enough in art school? Are they learning enough? And I'm like, well, what about all the people who actually don't get to post-secondary, right? So like what's happening in literally preschool through 12, which is like the arena that I work in, which I think is, not because I work in it, I think it's the most important, but I think it's kind of important. A, because it's super underfunded, but B, because this is the time where cognitively you have millions of people who are flexible and permeable in ways that we cannot even imagine, and they're in institutions that are not designed for their liberation, that are not designed in any way for critical thinking. And so what does it mean that we're having all these conversations about resistance, and I feel like there was a point in history where that conversation intersected with how we organize our schools, but I feel like a lot of these conversations are in no way connected to what do kids do for 8 hours during school. And I spend all of my time during the week visiting schools and watching what kids are doing in classrooms. And it's amazing to think about kids going from a math class to a Spanish class to a history class, and there being no context or conversation around how their subjectivity enters the space. There being no conversation around this particular moment that we're in and what that means for them when they graduate, if they can graduate, if there's a place for them to go when they graduate, if the school will exist in the next 2 weeks, 2 years, you know. So I guess I'm really interested in how we think about institutions that almost every single person in the world, in the United States context of the world, goes through every single day, and what does it look like to refocus our attention to really intervene in that way, and that not being something that requires a complete dismantling of current schools, because that's a different type of work. What does it mean to provide supplemental opportunities for young people to engage in this type of thinking? Because I think there is a perception that young people don't want to do this, and I think that's like the wrong-headed perception. They want to do it, but we aren't actually offering opportunities for them to do it. Yeah, I don't hear it.
I was thinking in relationship to what you were talking about, history and time, and how like history is constituted through exclusions, like history with capital H, and how that is enabled through like a homogeneous straight time, which like promises like teleological fantasy of futurity, and how like the interruption of like such time, or like of like time becoming non-linear, reminds me of like what like Karen Borat says in relationship to a past that is yet to come, or like future anterior, and in relationship to how these might not necessarily be actualizable, because like such like promise of future is like who actually is going to have time to such future, and how also history itself has been constituted by the like human, which has been mostly like white, straight, like heterosexual, heteronormative men. And also this idea of like being backward, which I think is actually very interesting in relationship to how never leaving the past behind. And also how like there's like people that talk about like counter memories as like those memories that like fail to fit within these like purified histories, and as like almost like transgenerational traumas who are not registered within the history of the colonizer, and also in relation to like a parasite, or like, and how like in French parasite also means noise, and like how like noise is like an interruption, and in the sense of like what would be noise for like a history of the colonizer, and also how like this noise as like a queer gesture could like expose what should remain concealed.
Just to pick up and maybe conclude or wrap up this part, and then invite us to more informally engage this question of futurity and time, because a big part of the conference and the this thing that we made with wonderful contributions was in dedication to Jose Munoz, who was our advisor. And it's really Jose who has the kind of, for me, the last word about the idea of who doesn't have the, who has the privilege to give up on the idea of futurity, because who is being denied a future already. And so the project of Jose's was always one of taking Marxism and thinking about how Marxism could and should be read as a project that always originates outside of the center, which is part of the Black Jacobin book of C.L.R. James, and the rethinking of these different types of Marxism, which was gestured to earlier, not as identity, but as the way in which subjectivity is always a question of these politics of capitalism, as it tries to instrumentalize us as productive subjects. And so just by way of conclusion, I just wanted to read the little end of our intro where we kind of give a shout out to Jose, and maybe more articulately than I do off the cuff, or share some of his ideas. But we say that living labor is overshadowed by an explicit lateness, that of our mentor and friend. What began as a conference originally organized in collaboration with our advisor, Jose Munoz, quickly became an event of celebration, remembrance, and mourning after he passed away quite suddenly in December of 2013. Munoz's work and teaching continues to be a guiding resource for a vast array of scholars seeking critiques of capitalism that go beyond a vulgar class reductionism and that depart from the conventions of a revolution that would simply propose to seize the mode of production. His scholarship abounds with references to the idea of lingering, delaying, staying, and or being with, and other ways of showing up late to demands of the presentness as both an affective and political condition that goes far beyond a simple aversion to normative temporality. And just as an aside, Jose was always late to everything, in case you didn't know him. Among the many things that Munoz's work has taught us is that the queer way legacy works is by orienting us towards a figure that is gone and also not yet here, past and present, shacked up together, falling outside of a strictly productive time, giving time over to creating something else between them. There are many specters that haunt this special issue, some more personal and powerful than others, all of which call on a different way of imagining how knowledge is produced, shared, and mobilized across space and time. Spread out in this way, the project of living labor extends far beyond this special issue or the conference on which it is based, and I would say even beyond our own organizing around this. It's a project that many scholars will sense and activate in different ways. To live labor is to negotiate the extended process of reproducing ourselves and others. To live labor is to engage the material conditions that traverse personhood and thinghood. To live labor is to attend to the forces, resonances, and energies that intertwine the affects and objects of everyday life. So thank you all very much for being part of this experiment. I really do encourage you to get a drink and spend a little time maybe talking less formally. And thank you so much to Avram and Kameelah in particular.